This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about who we are. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today is a very special episode. The question here is about life before farming. What was it like? Was it nasty, brutish and short, or did hunter-gatherer ancestors of ours live lives that were relatively free, healthy, and ecologically stable? Now, in the lack of a time machine, many anthropologists have sought answers from studying the very few hunter-gatherer communities that still exist today. In 1966, several of the leading names in that field were invited to share their results at a symposium held in the University of Chicago. The symposium, called Man the Hunter, became a landmark event and the impact was huge. But what exactly were the results? And have they stood the test of time? To mark the 6-year anniversary of the Man the Hunter Symposium, On Humans is glad to share the first ever long-form podcast with the legendary anthropologist and co-organiser of the symposium, Richard B. Lee. We discussed the legacy of the conference, Lee's own experiences living with hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, and his reflections on what we do and do not know about the ancient lifeways of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. Now, for anyone working anywhere close to this topic, Richard Lee does not need an introduction, but for those who are new to the topic, I'll just say a couple of brief words. So Lee is a Canadian anthropologist who in the 60s did some really groundbreaking research with the toThe, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups in the Kalahari Desert in southwestern Africa. Now, in some ways, of course, they're a very peculiar group of people. They have their own history and their own culture. But as Lee points out in this episode, they have some striking similarities to many completely unrelated groups far away in other countries who also live from wild foods day to day without hoarding food for the future. They don't have leaders with power to tell others what to do. They don't have strict hierarchies based on wealth. And in many ways, they seem to be quite healthy, at least if they survive the extremely dangerous time that is human childhood. So, do they represent something of an original affluent society, as one participant in the 1966 symposium suggested? Or is this simply repeating the old naive stereotype of a noble savage? We discuss these and many more questions in this episode that touches on a lot of points about the legacy of the Man the Hunter conference. For example, those arising from the super influential book The Dawn of Everything by David Wengrow and David Graeber. Now, some of you might be disappointed, though, that we don't actually go into the recent controversies around women hunters very much. The main reason is that, to be frank, I am relatively tired of covering that topic. And I was glad to hear that actually Richard Lee agreed with my conclusion on the debate. If you're interested, you can check it out at onhumans.substack.com. There's a direct link to my article in the show notes. I've done a couple of episodes on it, so there's plenty up there if you want to dig deep into the weeds of that question. But for a more general outlook on the legacy of Man the Hunter Conference and the question about the lifeways of existing hunter-gatherers and our shared hunter-gatherer ancestors, I'm very glad to bring you Richard Lee, reflecting on 6 decades of trying to understand the original economy of humanity. I hope that you enjoy this, and we'll get started in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to say a very warm thank you to all the wonderful people who have made this episode possible by supporting On Humans at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much for your support. This episode, as always, is dedicated to you. But whoever you are, wherever you are, whether you are a supporter or not, whether you're exercising, running errands, commuting, or just wanting to learn more about humans, welcome to the ride. Let's go. Professor Richard B. Lee, welcome to On Humans.
Great to be here.
This is very exciting. I've had many guests that I've been looking forward to a lot, but there's actually a personal anecdote why this is particularly important for me. It was 2017 when I had just gotten my degree in philosophy and psychology, and I was at the airport in Helsinki reading the Financial Times, and there was a book review, an anthropology book. It wasn't a field that I had really any contact with at that time. It was James Sussman's Affluent Without Abundance. And I thought I would read you a little section from this review, and maybe that can serve as a basis for our conversations.
Great.
So, quote, 50 years ago, at a symposium of anthropologists in Chicago, a new consensus emerged on the mode of production of hunting and gathering peoples. Their lives, the researchers agreed, were not, as they had frequently been represented, nasty, brutish and short. On the contrary, hunter-gatherers enjoyed, or had until recent times, a varied diet that provided more than adequate calorific intake, if fluctuating one, and a 20-hour work week that left ample time for leisure and sleep. This had been achieved, furthermore, without the development of social hierarchies or exploitative gender relations, and without environmental degradation, unquote. So yeah, there I was with my philosophy and psychology degree, reading this, and I was like, "Oh my God, this requires some reading." And for those listeners who don't know, this epic symposium in 1966 in Chicago was the Man the Hunter conference, and it was organized by you. So that turned my life first slowly, and then less slowly, towards having an interest in this field and having a chat with you today.
Great.
So what do you think of Financial Times' portrayal of the legacy, the meaning, significance of Man the Hunter conference?
I was very taken. I don't know James Sussman well, but he's a generation after me and worked in the same parts of Botswana and Namibia that I did. And he was always somewhat, it seemed to me, somewhat skeptical of the original affluent society argument. And so when he put out this book 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, I was taken by the fact that he had somehow found, he had his, on the road to Damascus or something, he found his, say, well, maybe Lee and his colleagues were right after all.
Yeah.
So he could balance that, yes, they had this way of life, and yes, they have been exploited by colonialism, but that doesn't erase the fact that they actually had this pretty solid existence.
When you say these people, we're talking about the Sun hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert. There's a lot of names, by the way, around this topic. Sometimes you hear, I can't do the clicks, but sometimes you hear Kung, sometimes you hear Jihuanzi, sometimes you hear Sun. For a lot of people, probably the name that they'll be most familiar with is the Bushmen, though I think that that's somewhat of a derogatory term, so less used nowadays. But before we start talking about them, about what can we learn from you, for example, having lived with them, who are they?
I mean, this is a very legitimate question. The Khoisan language group includes people who were historically known as Bushmen and people who were historically known by the also derogatory term Hottentots. And in the interests of making this more faithful to their own self view, we now speak of the Khoi, who were historically sheep and cattle herders,
Okay.
and the San, who were historically hunters and gatherers. The Kung is a term that was put into circulation, particularly by the excellent work of Lorna Marshall, who was an American anthropologist who worked there in the 50s and 60s. And it was a misnomer because there are Kung speakers, but when I got there and started referring to them as the Kung, pretty early on, they said, we're not Kung. The Kung live over there. We can understand them sometimes, but that's not who we are. And so I said, well, tell me who we are.
Yeah.
And they said, we are the Junkwasi. And Junkwasi is translated is real people. It was a bit of a revelation to me. However, Kung, it was a lot easier to pronounce than Junkwasi. So as a result, Kung remained in regular use right into the 21st century. And in 2025, there's been a tremendous amount of work in paleogenetics that have, I would say, established the Khoisan speaking people of Southern Africa as representing a certain segment of humanity that has antiquity and has been in the geographic area for a very long time. and yet are still part of the larger human family.
And today they are quite small part, but am I right that I think the genetics suggests that probably at some point the ancestors of these Khoisan people were the majority
Yes,
of humanity?
which is fascinating if you think of where were we 100,000 years ago. That always struck me as a remarkable statement, to think of the world as we know it, Asia, Africa, Oceania, the Americas, and yet the largest population at that time in prehistory were the Southern African Khoisan speakers, or people who had that genetic heritage, is a pretty interesting uh, point. And even more interesting is that as a graduate student in 1963, I could actually go out and find people living that way of life in a more or less independent existence, where they were making their full living 365 as hunter-gatherers.
Okay, and if we zoom out a little bit, the reason why people like me have been so fascinated by these people, and I can't do the clicks as I said, so I'm just going to say Juhuansi, is that not only do they live from hunting and gathering, or they still lived from hunting and gathering when, for example, you went there in the 60s, the original economy, so to speak, of humanity, but also they lived on a kind of dry African landscape. They come genetically, as you mentioned, from a kind of root population. So there's a lot of things that could make someone think that we can see something about what used to be much more common for humans in the way that these people still lived. That was, of course, one of the major reasons why, for example, Financial Times was interested in this work.
Yes.
Now, of course, also these people do live in history. So it's a big question of how much can they, or how much can any hunter-gatherer tell us about the past. And I want to talk about that with you.
Yes.
And so we will get there, but before the Juhuansi become a kind of part of a theoretical debate, inquiry, I want to make sure that we do justice to them as people.
Right.
Forgetting all the theory, forgetting about, I don't know, Man the Hunter conference, forgetting about human evolution, forgetting about the Pleistocene.
Yes.
Could you maybe just take me and take the listeners to your first encounter with the Juhuansi?
I've written about this because it's a good story and it's all true. But when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I was fortunate to have as one of my thesis advisors J. Desmond Clark, who was a famous Africanist archaeologist who had worked in Zambia for many years. And he had a shopping list of projects he wanted to see done, including excavating sites. And he said, and we need to send someone out to the Kalahari to see if we can find if there's any Bushmen left out there still hunting and gathering. So that's when I put my hand up. I said, that's the one I want. And so Irv DeVore and I got an NSF grant, the National Science Foundation. And then I drove in the general direction of where I was told. And with an interpreter, I asked, are there any people around here who hunt and gather? And I was told, no, there aren't. But if you go west a certain distance, may find some. And so I drove out and I stopped in the first village. And I said, this village is got something interesting, which is they have cattle and goats. But I knew they were Junkwasi. So I said, are you Junkwasi? Yes, we are, through the interpreter. And do you hunt and gather? They said, yes, we do, but we also keep goats and cattle. So I said, is there another group? Are there any people around here who still live by hunting and gathering? And they said, yes, there are. You have to go to a place called Dobie. It's about an hour's drive west of here. And it's pretty close to the border between what was then Bechuanaland Protectorate and the South African occupied colony of Southwest Africa. And there you will find them. So I drove there and came to a very kind of wild looking area. And there was a tiny little water hole that I was told to park at. And then people came out of the bushes. And that was my first, literally my first encounter. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was October of 1963. And I had an interpreter who could speak English and Setswana. And then I had a second interpreter who could speak Setswana and Junkwasi.
Oh, so it was a chain. I see.
Everything had to go through the chain on day one. And people introduced themselves. And
what was it like the very first when they see that there is this foreign-looking white man standing here? What was there? How did they approach you?
That was interesting because they seemed pretty open to having me. I said, I'd like to camp here for a while and live with you, live next door to you. And they said, okay, we can do that. And so, but then here's the punchline. When the group of us, half a dozen people, went back to their villages, their homes, the older gentleman who became immortalized in my writing and the writing of many others by the name of Komagwe. And the gway is a fruit called the sour plum. And he was definitely a sour plum. He had a plum side to him, but he had a very sour disposition. And then he and my interpreter, he signaled that the interpreters should come and we should have a private conversation. And then he said, I'm so happy to see you here because finally we have a white man of our own. All the other people got the white men and we didn't get them. And now we've got you.
Okay.
And then he was referring to the fact that just about 30 miles west of where I was working, 10 years earlier, the Marshall family had come and done their pioneering field work. And the Marshall family were actually a wonderful group of humanitarians and philanthropists, but they were also extremely wealthy because the late Lawrence K. Marshall had founded the Raytheon Corporation and had sold it in the late 40s. So he was always a member of the plutocracy. But he said, okay, we sold the business. What do we do now? And his wife said, let's go to the Kalahari. And he had two teenage children at that point, Elizabeth and John. And they went and set up shop and did wonderful work and distributed, liberally distributed goods. So my informant, Komagwe, was saying they got all the goods and we were just sitting here and we never got anything, which it turns out to be a form of discourse, which we later discovered is pretty central to their conversational, their worldview and conversation, which my wife, Harriet Rosenberg, who's also an anthropologist, coined the term complaint discourse, because complaining was one of their favorite modes of conversation, often in a very good-natured sort of joking sort of way. But in this case of Komagwe, he was very serious. And he said, Now, I want you to give everything you've got to our group, to me and my group, and don't give anything to any of those other people. And I'm I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, these are supposed to be the egalitarian
Yes.
for whom sharing is a way of life. And yet here's this guy. And so I said, this is definitely more, there's a lot more going on here than I had bargained for. And so I immediately started to pack away all my ideas of Rousseauian noble savages. And, the idea that I finally found, the beginning of all good things. And it was this old timer who was pretty cranky. He was cranky. But then it later turned out that this is a mode of discourse. And when it came to doing the day's work, he was out there sharing his food. So it was a mode of discourse. So that was my first day introduction to the Junquasi.
How has the life of the Junquasi, it has changed a lot, I've understood. During the decades of going back, anything that that you might want to share about how things have developed since 63?
Well, I continued to go back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. I was even there in July of 2024 on a sentimental journey with my children, my adult children and grandchildren. All of my three kids had grown up being dragged along on field trips in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so they had a very strong attachment to their childhood memories and adolescent memories and wanted to make a sentimental journey. But then the question, which is an important one, is what happened to them? Were they completely consumed by wage labor? Were they completely consumed by poverty and exploitation? And it's fair to say that many of the San people in Southern Africa ended up on farms, on European farms, in super exploitative situations. But thanks to the efforts of the Marshall family and others, the Junquasi on the Namibian side in an area called Nyainai had actually preserved their land base. And even though when you would meet them in 2024 or even years earlier, they were dressed in Western clothing with a few interesting embellishments. They had their cell phones in their pockets and they were using them. But when you actually did detailed work on their subsistence, it turned out they were still getting 20 to 40% of their food from the bush. So on paper, if you just looked at their store-bought food or what they got in government rations, you would say these people are incredibly poor. But in fact, because they had the fallback of the bush foods were still there, they actually lived a much more reasonable life than they otherwise would. So they didn't abandon their hunting and gathering, for example.
Very interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think that's a good moment to then zoom out a little bit and discuss the lifestyle that they have slowly abandoned more and more, not completely, the lifestyle of hunting and gathering. And maybe this is a good moment to bring back the Man the Hunter conference.
Right.
And there, it wasn't just you, but there were many anthropologists who had been observing people living from wild foods, living from hunting, living from gathering and fishing.
Right.
And trying to see if what are the similarities, what are the differences between these people. And if what Financial Times, for example, how it portrayed it was that this was a moment when the consensus amongst the scholars started turning away from an idea that these are the poorest of the poor, the bottom of social evolution,
Right.
who have, for some reason, haven't realized yet the virtues of farming. And towards the idea that actually this is quite a good adaptation and in many ways produces a life which is perhaps not completely a Rousseauian ideal, as you just mentioned, but is in some very interesting ways even enviable.
Right.
Do you think that's a fair characterization of what the conference meant from your vantage point? Or how do you look back at the legacy of the 1966 gathering?
It's very interesting because the title of the conference and the title of the book that resulted was Man the Hunter. And an inordinate amount of criticism and pushback came to around the title. We could talk about how the term man as a general term for humanity figured in humanistic and scientific discourse in the 20th century, because it certainly had what I would call a left wing. To say man in that context is saying, see, God is no longer in charge. God is no longer in charge. So it was revolutionary in that respect. And so the generation before me saw man, the use of the term man, as liberatory and pushing against the dominant view of that God rules it all, rules over all, rules the universe. And the fight is still going on and waxes and wanes. So what was given less attention was the contents of the book, which made, I think, two major points, even though they were disputed. The first point was that summarized in the classic essay by Marshall Solins, The Original Affluent Society, the first point was that they don't, their life is not nasty, brutish, and short. They actually live adequately or even more than adequately. And then the second major finding was hunting is not the dominant source of food. In fact, gathering is the dominant source of food. And much of the gathering, not all of it, is done by women. So this is actually a major statement about the importance of women in human evolution. But as everyone pointed out, vegetable foods do not last as in archaeological contexts in the same way that stone tools do. And so it's pretty hard to find any solid evidence archaeologically of the vegetable diet. Although sophisticated methods of analyzing teeth, the chemical composition of teeth, have made some major breakthroughs in estimating whether the protein came from land-based sources or marine-based sources, and so on.
Yeah.
So those were the two findings of the 1966 Man the Hunter Conference.
Well, I think first looking at just the idea of the original affluent society, I think this is one which, from my eyes, has only gotten stronger and stronger with time. And here's my reason for that. When I read Salins' essay, I have to say I wasn't completely convinced, because he made some very interesting points, which were data-based, but he also has a lot of talk about how there's two ways to have affluence. One is that you have a lot of needs and you fulfill them, and the other one is a Zen path. He literally uses the word Zen, right, of not having that many needs. And I was like, well, maybe, but this might also be romanticizing poverty and whatnot. But what really is interesting is that if we focus now on the word original, is this something that's just happening right now in these societies, or is this something that speaks about the long stretch of hunting and gathering in the human story? Well, the archaeology is pretty clear that early farmers were shorter and generally suffered from worse health
Right.
than the hunter-gatherers of that time. And so this idea that economically a lot of hunter-gatherers get a lot of food without working that hard in a way that they can actually maintain a better health, for me that seems to be even stronger as a case. How did you see that archaeology coming out of these early farmers being really short?
Yes.
Did you follow it closely and were like, oh, we were right? Or what do you think of all of
Well, the
that?
late George Armelagos of Emory University was the pioneer in doing the research. This was 20, 25 years ago. And he did something that really turned some cherished views upside down, because the idea was, humanity discovers agriculture. Finally, we can relax. Now we can relax and we don't have to work our butts off like the hunter-gatherers. But then he and his co-researchers point out, well, this doesn't explain why their teeth are in much worse shape from archaeological evidence. Their bone is in worse shape. They're shorter in stature. And in general, they seem to have a much higher disease burden. And so one of the explanations, which makes perfect sense, is zoonoses. The idea, well, if you're living with animals, you're going to get a lot of cross-species infections. We now have bird flu to think about, and COVID, and so on. But that was a revelation in those days, and so it made a lot of sense that health and other things went down with the origin of agriculture. But on the plus side, their fertility went up. And so that became I'd say one of the population pressure became one of the driving forces that led to the next 3 or 4 stages in human evolution, in social evolution.
So instead of having less healthy people, you have more sickly people.
You have more people, and that the massive problems of, as I've put it in various writings, you can organize 50 people pretty reasonably on a person-to-person basis. It gets a lot harder with 500 people, but you can still do that. You can break up into smaller groups and interact on a less frequent basis. But then when you get into 5,000 and 50,000, you're dealing with you're dealing with challenges that are completely unprecedented in human evolution. And that's where we get the origin of inequality, the origin of chiefs, kings, empires, and so on.
That's really interesting, and that's exactly what I wanted to turn next, is this link between economy and political equality, freedom. And here I'm really interested because you use Jared Diamond in his really, really interesting essay where he calls agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race.
Yes.
He says something quite similar than what you just said, and I think the point there is also that, he says that once you start having surplus of food, then you can start having inequalities on who has the surplus. And that's a good story when you read it,
right.
But it's not inevitable that you have equality without surplus. I mean, chimpanzees don't have surplus, nor do they have empires, but they have pretty hierarchical social organization.
Right.
And baboons and whatnot. Not all animals, but you can have hierarchies without having surplus.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that it doesn't seem to my untrained eyes like the hunter-gatherers, well, they just couldn't have political inequalities. They could, and yet they don't to the extent many of us would predict. So what is it about living from wild foods that predisposes these people to be so equal politically and economically?
Well, it's here's the best I can do in answer of that. Uh, how do we account for our sense of justice and injustice? Because we all have an inborn sense of justice or injustice, and this is something the philosophers can grapple with. Where did that come from? And I would argue, well, it came from our ancestry as egalitarian hunter gatherers. But there is a big problem with that uh, proposition, which is some hunter gatherers are not egalitarian, and some of them are quite hierarchical. And so then the question is, here's a hunter gatherer, like the most famous examples are the First Nations people of the northwest coast of Canada
Yes.
and Alaska, the Tlingit, the Haida, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they are pretty darn hierarchical. And so there is a question, there is an argument that has been made. Well, they've been dealing with Europeans for 3 centuries, since the 1740s. And so that the European trade has made them more hierarchical. But then there are other archaeologists who say, no, the pre-Columbian archaeology shows that they had evidence in the burials and evidence in the house types of hierarchy. So there's something about that the egalitarian model does not fit all hunter-gatherers. It may fit most of them, but not all of them. And so the question is, well, what causes, this is one question, how can we predict the appearance of inequality? And it seems when you look at the most famous cases are on the Northwest coast and of coastal California. And what they have in common is enormous marine resources. In the case of the North, the salmon, and in the case of California, the shellfish, and fishing in general. So fishing can deliver surpluses. So the argument of surplus still has some merit because it's that surplus that allows them to generate, or that drives them to generate hierarchy.
And especially in the Pacific Northwest, what I've understood is that they store food quite extensively because they smoke salmon that comes
Right.
there once a year or twice a year because of seasonal cycles. I'm really happy that you brought them up. I mean, the big question then is, well, why aren't they an equally good model of human evolution? Why wouldn't there have been marine resources throughout human evolution? And I think there, one argument that I see quite a lot is that if you look at the archaeology, it's quite clear that you can see the emergence. Like I just recently Googled Pleistocene Holocene transition in Pacific Northwest, Pleistocene Holocene transition in Californian coast,
Right.
and in Australia. I tried the same thing, and it always brings up articles about how during these warmer, wetter times that agriculture has been blossoming in most of the world, in those areas you do see this intensification. And so that the archaeology suggests that this inequality that we observe in historic times, recent times there, has a beginning during the last 10,000 years. That's what I hear people make as an argument for not using these people as equally good best guesses of what life might have looked like 20,000 years ago, 40,000
well,
years ago.
that is an interesting angle. What I was going to say is that 10,000 years ago, the sea level was 300 feet lower than it is today because all that water was in the glaciers and in the ice age, and so much of the settlements that would have been hunter-gatherers in the late Pleistocene are underwater.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the kind of counter I was I was thinking we should engage with, which is to say that, well, maybe there were a lot of these kind of hierarchical hunter-gatherers living from salmon 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, and we just don't know about them because they are underwater now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely an issue. And one of the famous books in anthropology of the last 5 or more years is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And one of their arguments, they're pretty dismissive of the original affluent society argument. And so they've raised a lot of hackles in hunter-gatherer circles, research circles, who say that they just chuck out vast quantities of evidence. And they're making the argument that hunter-gatherers do not guarantee you're going to have an egalitarian society, nor does agriculture guarantee that you're going to have a hierarchical society.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that has been definitely an argument that those of us who still have much commitment to the general egalitarian proposition are still sort of grappling with. And it is true that the Graeber and Wengrow have, I think, their impact has been, they've been given more credit than they deserve. And David Graeber is gone, so you can't argue with him. But it does raise issues that are being grappled with.
But hold on a second. What if David Wengrow would be here? What do you think he dismisses in the evidence or doesn't see in the evidence? What does Dawn of Everything get wrong, or why do you say that it's being given more credit than it deserves?
I think people like Jerome Lewis at University College London, who I would think of as perhaps the leading figure in hunter-gatherer studies in the 2020s, has a lot of issues with them, and that they have dismissed the arguments made by Colin Turnbull and James Woodburn about egalitarianism.
And you.
And me. And that there's still some pretty strong evidence that maybe not all hunter-gatherers, but that most hunter-gatherers were closer to this egalitarian model. And one of the arguments that gives that strength is the incredible is it a coincidence? The fact that people in the Canadian Arctic, in Australian Aboriginals in the interior, in the Kalahari Desert, in enclaves in India, all have these remarkably similar egalitarian views. And similar views about child rearing, similar views about gender and gender equality and inequality. And so that there's something powerful there. You couldn't have 6 different, representatives of 6 different continents and have that degree of correspondence in key developments. So just to sort of follow that line, the new, I think, champion human evolutionary studies is Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, who in a series of books have made very powerful arguments that place women and children at the center of human evolution and what makes us human, and leaving men and their hunting and men and their power trips definitely off to one side. And I find her arguments very persuasive.
Yeah, we had a great conversation.
Okay, that is great. Yeah, I'm a big fan. We stay in regular contact.
And what you said earlier is for me personally, like I said, I was reading this one book review in 2017, but then when I started running the show and talking with more and more people who have actually lived with and hunter gatherers, what really did strike me is that I when I started the show, I had no idea about a group of people called the Bayaka in the Central African rainforest. And then I've had two people on the show who have lived with them, and I wasn't really surprised of what they told me. There was a way in which I could guess so much of what they lived like just from knowing that they are nomadic hunter-gatherers.
Right.
And so there does seem to be something quite strong in that. So it's not necessarily that, okay, every hunter-gatherer, they're all equal. Every farmer, they're all tyrannical. But there does seem to be a trend. The examples of hunter-gatherers that have these hierarchies, like the northwestern coast, they have food storage. They resemble agriculturalists in many ways. The farming communities that show a lot of equality are often examples of early farming communities in Europe. For example, in Ukraine, there's one site that David Wengro has been excavating, but that's very small in the large scale of things. I think there's less than 10,000 people living there. Also from the Native American cultures, you have examples like the Huron-Wendat. They talk quite a lot in The Dawn of Everything about them, but they also they also hunt quite a lot. Actually, interestingly, the women do all the farming amongst the Huron-Wendat. So when you compare non-food storage hunter-gatherers almost anywhere in the world, and you compare them to kind of intense agriculturalists almost anywhere in the world, for my eye, it does seem that there is still the exact same quite dramatic difference than what I thought before reading The Dawn of Everything.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned the Huron-Wendat because one of my closest colleagues was Eleanor Leacock, who died many years ago, but who was a specialist on hunter-gatherers of the North American Northeast. She went to Labrador and Newfoundland, or Labrador and northern Quebec, and she was also very knowledgeable about the Six Nations of the Iroquois. And one of the things that she wrote extensively about, which is extensively documented, was the degree of political power of women among the Huron and the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee. And one of my favorite books of all time is a book which I've extolled in various publications by Lewis Henry Morgan, entitled Houses and House Life of the American Aborigines. And Marx was an admirer of his, but he didn't admire Marx. But the terminology he employs to describe what's going on in American Indian life is communism in living. Communism in living. And so he describes how, regardless of whether you're on the Plains Indians, whether you're the Hopi or the Navajo or the Huron-Wendat or the Cherokee, there are powerful laws in place that you have to feed the widows and orphans, and you have to give hospitality to visitors. And it describes people who are mounted, people who are sedentary agriculturalists like the Hopi. It describes nomadic hunter-gatherers. It's a pretty powerful endorsement, or a pretty powerful statement about the importance of sharing.
And I think here comes the big question, which is how much of that is a social, political decision only? Is it just ideas, or is there something in the subsistence, in the economy, in the ecology that, if not determines that when you look at the Native Americans of these certain areas, they tend to have more equal power structures, and when you look at nomadic hunter-gatherers almost anywhere they do, Because what the Dawn of Everything is kind of trying to argue is that this is all, humans are free to choose.
Right.
We are not chained by our ecology.
Yes, there is something that mystifies me, which is there is a school within anthropology that's quite old, but persistent, which is, and I guess I would call it the idealist school in a philosophical sense, in that they say ecology has nothing to do with the way of life. The way of life is based on the mental blueprint that humans have, and that generates their religion, their speech, their social life, and so on, and ecology. And they seem to be quite dogmatic about ecology having nothing to do with any of this. And it seems I don't know where the animus is coming from, because people like me who are on the materialist side of the debate say, well, there is a way in which ecology meshes quite beautifully with social organization. And I document that in my book, The Kungsan Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society. And then I point out that every hunter-gatherer group, including the Northwest Coast, has a concentration dispersion pattern in the annual round. There are periods when they concentrate and there are periods when they disperse. And it's just as true of the Inuit as it is of the Australian Aborigines. And so the question is, what accounts for this? And the answer that I give is, well, there's social imperatives that make people want to congregate, and there's ecological imperatives that force them to disperse. And so life becomes a balance between the ecological and the social, but they're extremely well integrated. And this has been a formula that's worked for, millennia, many millennia. And so why be so dogmatic about ecology has nothing to do with it. And I'll say one more thing, because maybe I haven't driven home the point. How do you sustain a large group if you're nomadic hunter-gatherers? And the answer is you can sustain it, but you have to walk farther to find the food to feed the 200 people than if you're only feeding 20 people. So people's workload goes way up. But they say the workload has gone way up, but the social rewards make it worthwhile. But there comes a point when you can't really sustain a group of 200, and then people say, well, it's time to disperse, or they start fighting with each other, and then they say, we're leaving. And whatever it is, this pattern of concentration dispersion seems to be part of our history. And then one of the ways that I put this is that agriculture means that you can spend 12 months of the year in the concentrated mode, and there's no dispersion. So agriculture means you can maximize your social side by having daily interaction with hundreds of people. Whereas if you were a hunter-gatherer, you couldn't sustain that. So I find that a pretty reasonable argument.
Well, let's start wrapping up here.
Okay.
Always my final question to my guest is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, this came up in my conversation with Vivek Venkataraman in a interview that's in press now in the Journal of Hunter-Gatherer Research. And so I reminded him that in the opening paragraph of Man the Hunter, Irv DeVore and I wrote an introduction. And in the introduction, the year was 1966, we put forward a rather bold argument. And the argument, in a nutshell, goes like this. If you look at the history of humanity, something like 60%, because there were 1 million years of hunter-gatherers and only 10,000 years of everybody else, or 12,000, 60% of every human being that ever lived on Earth were hunters and gatherers. And when we first wrote that, we used the figure 90%. But then our outlook has changed as we learn more about the demography. So then it's an open question whether humanity, we had a long history of hunters and gatherers. We had a very meteoric rise of agriculture, chiefdoms, states, empires, industrial empires, and now we're faced with multiple crises: war, overpopulation, famine, climate change, making the planet uninhabitable. So it's an open question whether humanity survives. And so if humanity doesn't survive, interplanetary archaeologists of the future will come to this planet and say, well, what we have here is a long history, successful history of hunters and gatherers, followed by a very rapid efflorescence of civilization leading directly to destruction. And since the last 3 months, unfortunately, that particular prognosis has become even more likely than not. 5-10 years ago, we thought, well, maybe Greta Thunberg will actually save us by making all generations realize that we have to do drastic action to survive. But now that seems to be less likely than. So there's that's how my worldview has been affected by this.
Professor Richard Lee, thank you so much for your decades and decades of research and for your time today.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation. All the best.
Okay, that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you like this and you want more material on humans, do subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you're using. And if you're someone who returns to the show and wants to show a little bit of support, the easiest thing to do is, of course, to share the episode. Give the show 5 stars if you think that it deserves it. And of course, if you do want, you can always head to patreon.com/onhumans to donate directly to the costs of the show. Or of course, you can just sit back and enjoy this free-for-all material, making new research on humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. Until next time, take care.